Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Yud Aleph. This week's learning is sponsored anonymously in gratitude to Rabbi Carl Perkins, a learned and compassionate rabbi, a gifted teacher whose love of Judaism inspires all who are blessed to know him. Today's daf is sponsored by Paul and Danielle Nakamumi. Mazal tov to our daughter and son-in-law in their marriage. May you enjoy many years of joy together. Today's daf is sponsored by Natanya Slamowitz in loving memory of her mother, Chaviva Lilka Bat Necha and Abraham. Okay, we'll get started with today's daf with Onkelos. Okay, I hope you're enjoying this Masechet. I actually started reading an article over Shabbat by Yehuda Brandis, and basically he was trying to say, I don't know why all the yeshivas don't learn this Masechet, because it's a fascinating Masechet, super relevant in terms of relations with Gentiles, which, go on all around the world. Even if you're living in Israel these days, it also happens, and all the more so if you're not living in Israel. And how it's such a relevant, interesting Masechet. There's all sorts of things that you're going to say, wow, I can't believe this in the Gemara. And also, wow, I can't believe this is where it is in the Gemara because I've learned this so many years and, never knew where it was. So anyway, it was actually, it was written a number of years ago and they were starting to learn it. And he was teaching and he said, here's the promo for it. And this is, why it's really important to learn. Anyway, on that note, we'll get started. We're going to start with Onkelos. Okay, Onkelos is known from Targum Onkelos on the Torah. Whether this is the same Onkelos or not is a bit debatable, but most people think this is the same Onkelos. So Onkelos bar Clonimus Igayer. Onkelos was a convert, okay, and especially if he then translated the whole Torah, fascinating that this was done by a convert. In any case, Onkelos bar Clonimus converted. Now we're going to hear the story, what happens after. Some people claim, there's a footnote in the Quran that says that it's possible that there's actually source to think that he was related or connected with the emperor, which then makes sense in terms of the context of the story. And the emperor is going to go far out of his way to basically he's basically going to send people, we're going to see right now, Shadar Kesar Gunda de Romai Abatre. So the Caesar, the emperor, sends a fleet of soldiers after him to seize him. Whether they wanted to kill him, whether they wanted to get him to convert back, not unclear what they wanted with him, because you'll see they never actually succeed in getting him, because three times, we have three times where he's going to send people to bring him. And I see Ruth, you're writing to me that he was Titus's nephew. I don't know what the source for that is, but possibly it's another explanation. So anyway, he basically tries to bring Onkelos back. What happens? Well, three sets of soldiers are going to be unsuccessful, and we'll see why. The first one, we don't really get why, but Mashchinu B'Kai Igayer. So he pulls them with psukim, and he gets them to convert. So basically, we start off with Onkelos converts, then the emperor sends messengers to seize him, and he somehow quotes psukim, convinces them to convert to Judaism. We don't know what psukim he quotes, but he quotes psukim, convinces them to convert to Judaism, and that's the end. They don't ever go back. Amar lehu, Hadar Shadar Gunda Deroma Yachrina Abatre. So, the emperor realizes what happens. He sends another troop of soldiers to get him. Amar lehu, Lo Temer Leva Lo Midi. And then he says, don't say anything to him. Okay, don't open your mouths. I don't want you to engage in conversation. When they get there, he says, listen, I'm just going to, you don't want to engage in conversation, no problem. I'm just going to tell you one thing. Nifura, who's like a lowly officer, Nakat Nura Kame Pifura, holds a torch or, the light for the Pifura, like an apifura. So Hebrew word for Pope. Here we mean, for the next in line, for the one above him. Pifiora ledukasa, the pifiora for the duke. Dukasa lehegmona, the dukasa holds for the governor. Hegmona lekoma, and the hegmon holds for the emperor. In other words, everybody serves the person above him. Koma mina katnura makame inashe. So he says, now, does the emperor hold the light for the people? Right? Of course not. Why would the emperor do that, right? Amrule, lo. They said to him, no, definitely not. Amar lehu, Akadosh Baruch Hu nakat nura kamei Yisrael. He says, but look, God, who, would be the comparison to the top ruler that there is in Judaism, God holds the light, holds the torch for the people. Okay? Judaism has a different structure than the political structure of the Romans. The Romans, it's all about serving the higher echelons of society, and the higher rulers. And every ruler is just out there to get their respect. But in Judaism, God actually serves the people. It's a better form of religion, or a better form of, to be a part of. How do we know this? You have to read the rest of the pasuk, but this is God of the desert, goes before them, with the anan to show them the way, and at night with the fire, in order to light up the way for them. So here you see, our God holds the torch for the people and helps lead us. Igayr Kulu. Well, they all convert. Hadar Shadragunda Achrina Abatre. He sends another troop of soldiers. The emperor. Amar Lahu, Lo Tishtau Midi Bahade. Don't engage in any sort of conversation. Okay, this is going one step farther. Really just shut your mouths, shut your ears, don't listen, don't anything. Kinaktele, Azle Chaze, so he doesn't start engaging in conversation. What does he do? Chaze mezuzta demancha pitra, otev yade ale. So there's a mezuzah there, right? So he sees a mezuzah Onkelos, and he puts his hand on it. This is, by the way, where the source for kissing the mezuzah comes from here. Va'amar lehu mai hai. And he says to them, what is this? Amrule emalanat. So they say, you tell us. Amar lehu minago shel olam. The way the world works, melech basar v'dam, yoshem mibifnim, v'avadam shomim oto mibachutz, right? The regular king. King sits inside and has servants watching from the outside. Again, the same concept. When it comes to God, is the people who serve him are inside, and God protects us from the outside. That's what the mezuzah is for, Shenemal, as it says, and then he quotes a pasuk as well. Hashem yishmor tzedcha v'acham me'atav olam. Some people, by the way, when they kiss the mezuzah, they say this pasuk, and it's based on this Gemara. God will protect your going out and your entries forever. And again, Igayr, he convinces them to convert, and Chulo Shadar Batre. And the emperor gave up at that point of coming after Onkelos and just let it be. He said, I don't want to lose more people to convert to Judaism, and didn't bother him anymore. Okay, back to this was apropos the stories of Antoninus and Rebbi. We got from there to Katir Bar Shalom, who ends up getting his portion of Olam Haba. From there we go to Onkelos, right? These are all Romans who basically understood that Judaism was better than their religion, right? Katia at least helped the Jews. He didn't convert, but he did get himself a place in the world to come, and Onkelos converts. Vayomer Hashem la shnei goyim bevitnich. Okay, going back to, we've been talking about Esau and Yaakov, Esau being Rome and Yaakov being the Jews. So we go back to the original prophecy that Rivka gets when she's pregnant with them. There's two nations in your womb. Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. Al tikre goyim. Don't read it as goyim. Ela geyim. Okay, with two yuds instead of a vav and a yud. What are geyim? Geyim means proud, which also means great. Okay, and what we're going to say is there's two great people in your womb, as opposed to we're always thinking they're always fighting with each other. There was one time in history where there were these two great people that came out from Rivka that were two people who got along with each other and were both great. Who is that? Ze Antoninus for Rebbi. Shelo pasku me'al shulchanam. Now we're going to see how great things were for them. They never stopped having on their tables lo chazeret velo kishut velo tznon. Okay, you might be surprised by this choice of food. This shows great wealth or they had everything. What did they have? Chazeret, which is a type of lettuce, kishut, cucumbers or zucchinis, and snon, radishes. Okay, why is that so important? We'll see in a minute. Lo b'yimot ha'kshama v'lo b'yimot ha'kshamim. In other words, both they never stopped having these, even in the winter, even in the summer. In other words, they're seasonal. They only grow sometimes a year, but somehow they manage to get them all year round. Da'amar mar. Now, why are they so important? Because it's said about these foods, snon machatech ochel, chazer ma'apech machal, kishut marchiv me'ayin. These three foods allow for good digestion of your food. So what it really meant was they had tons of food, of lots of things and delicacies. And if you remember, Rebbi was the Nasi. He was prominent. He had wealth. And Antoninus obviously also. And in order to be able to eat that much food, you have to also have a good digestive system. And therefore, these foods would help the food to be digested. First of all, the commentaries quote, Rebbi was known not to have eaten a lot. And he also, by the way, at the end of his life had stomach issues, but they claim that this was for his people, the people living in his household, not necessarily for him, even though he refrained from eating so much food. There was plenty in his household. Anyway, that's a side question. To which the Gemara asks a different side question. Why are they called kishuim? Kishuim, according to the braita in the house of Rabbi Ishmael, they're called kishuim because they're kashim. They're hard for people, like swords. They're bad for your intestines and for your digestion. So they say lo kashya habaravrave habazutri. There's different types. There's large ones; those are hard. But the smaller ones are actually better for your digestive system. So it depends which type. Okay, what they mean we don't really know, but we don't try to take too much food advice from the rabbis. Plus, we don't know exactly, some people call them cucumbers, some people call them zucchini, some people call them, right, other things, something from that family, and maybe two different types within the family. Okay, that ends our section on Antoninus and Rebbe, and now we're going to go, right, what's clear from this section is they're describing this was idyllic, right, because usually, and what, we've been seeing these stories since we started the Masechet, really, it's, the Romans were evil and bad, and we're going to see more of that today. But there was this one time in history, and maybe more, but they wanted to highlight this one time or this one relationship between Antoninus and Rebbe that describes some idyllic state that the Romans, aren't all bad, and it's not all terrible. And there's this hope, ray of hope. But now we're going to get back to the Mishnah and all these holidays that you're not allowed to do business with them. So Yom HaLeidah v'Yom HaMitah. We had the day of the birth of the king and the day of the death of the king. That was what Rabbi Meir said. Came the rabbis and said, well, the death, it depends. If they burn things, which we said could be incense, could be items of the king. Today we're going to see that the Bavli clearly understood it as items of the king and not incense. If they burn items of the king, then it's forbidden to do business with them. If they don't, then it's not. So we're going to have to understand what's the source of what's at the root of the debate between the rabbis and Rabbi Meir. Michlal, so they're going to infer something at first. It sounds like, to Rabbi Meir Savar, Losh namita sheyesh basrefa, v'losh namita she'em basrefa, right? Rabbi Meir, obviously, who doesn't distinguish between whether they burn things or didn't burn things, thinks the palche ba'avodah l'avodah zarah. No matter what, on the day of the death of the king, they worship idols, okay? Regardless of whether they burn items, don't burn items. No matter what, they worship avodah zarah. Alma srefa lav chukahi. That means that he must think that burning itself, since the burning isn't a relevant issue, they worship the idols anyway on the day of the death of the king, then it must be that burning is not part of a custom of idolatry. Okay, burning items of the king is not an idolatrous custom because that's not relevant here. The only relevant thing is it the day of the death of the king or not? That's what determines and not whether or not they burn the items of the king. But Michlal de Rabbanan Savre, but the rabbis who disagree must hold Sreifa Chukahi. Sreifa, the burning items of the king, must be an idolatrous custom. So now the Gemara says, but how could you possibly say that? V'hatanya, doesn't it say in a braita? Surfim ala malachim v'lo midarcheha emoli. You're allowed to burn things of the king, and it's not considered the way of the Gentiles and the way of the idol worshippers, meaning that it's very obvious from here, and it can't be the rabbis disagree with this, that we can burn items of a king, and that's not an idolatrous custom then. So now we have to go back and figure out the rabbis. But before we get there, we're going to see a source for this. What's their source? Right? The ichukai, if it's a chukah, if it's an idolatrous custom, anan hechi sarfina. How do we do this? It says you can't go in their ways. Okay, if you want to learn more about Chukot Goyim, and you can follow in Hebrew, so Dr. Meir Shiur went up about last night about specifically this issue of Chukot Goyim, what that includes, what's not included. But clearly this can't be included if it's not an idolatrous custom. And Ella de Kule Alma, right now we're going to see Kule Alma Lav Sreifa Lav Chukai. Okay, now that wait, did I skip something? There was a pasuk here, no? Where's the pasuk? Second. Maybe it's quoted later. I guess it's quoted later. Yeah, it's quoted later. Okay, we're going to get back to this. Thought it was now, but it comes later. Later, we're going to see a pasuk that proves this. Okay, so the pasuk's coming later. We're going to do a gufa and go into this. Sorry, I got confused for a minute. Okay, so now they say, Ella, it must be de kule alma sreif alav chukai. Ella chashivute. Now they're going to say, even the rabbis think it's not a chukah. Can't be. Can't be an idolatrous custom, otherwise Jews wouldn't do it. And we're going to see that we did it. So it must be chashivute. What does that mean? If you burn, it means, okay, we're going to see it's important. Okay, let's read one more minute. They're going to explain it better. Rabbi Meir savar lo shnamita sheyesh basrifa velo shnamita she'en basrifa palchi bei lavodah kochavim. When the king dies, the day of the king's death, they turn it into a pagan holiday, and they definitely worship idols. It doesn't make a difference whether they burn items, don't burn items, no matter what, it's a pagan holiday, and they're worshiping idols while they do that. Or I don't know if you call it a pagan holiday, but the point is it's a day where they worship idols because the king died. The Rabbanit savre, but the rabbis disagree and say no. Mita sheyesh basreifa chashivalu upalchima. If they burn the king's items, then that means it's an important day. In other words, that king, you can imagine sometimes the king dies, they don't care about the king so much, so they won't worship their idols. What's an indicator? It's just an indicator. What's an indicator that they're going to worship idols? If they burn the items of the king, then it means that they consider this a significant day, and then it's an indicator that they're going to worship idols. Not that burning clothes has anything to do directly. It's not idol worship, but it's an indicator that this day will now be a day where they will worship idols. If they don't bother burning the items of the king, lo chashiva velo palchuba. It's not important enough to them, and therefore they're not going to worship idols on that day. And that's the machloket between them. So everyone agrees, and that's what we're going to go into now, that burning items of the king is actually not forbidden. It's not idol worship at all. So gufa. We burn items of the king and it's not considered darchei mori. Now here we're going to go into it and see the pasuk that I was looking for before. Bishalom tamut. It's a pasuk from Yirmiyahu, and it's Yirmiyahu prophesizing to Tzidkiyahu, who's the last king before the destruction. And he says to him, Bishalom tamut. You're not going to die by being killed by the enemy. You're going to die by natural means. Ubimisrafot avicha melachim, and the ways that they burn the things of your father, they're going to burn things for you when you die. In other words, you're not going to die a disgraceful death. You're going to die a respectful death. And we're going to do the things that we did with your fathers, meaning this was done for the Judean kings, and this was done for Tzidkiyahu. So it shows that the Jews were doing this. They were burning things of the kings. And now they go on and they say, not just kings, but also Nisiim, right? They didn't have kings anymore in the time of the Mishnah, right? But they did have Nisiim. They also burned for Nisiim when they died. Like, for example, Rabban Gamliel, we're going to see. Umayin Sorfim ala Melachim, what do they burn? Mitatan uklei tashmishan. They burn their beds and they burn items that they used, okay? Vessels that serve them. We'll see soon what this also includes, which could also be clothes. Right? I assume what they do is they burn these items because the king used them and they don't want anyone else using them. It wouldn't be respectful, so they burn them. So there was, again, it's hard for us to understand this, not to mention it's Baal Tashchit. We're going to talk about that soon. It's just, destroying items. There's obviously a pull here, right? On the one hand, we don't like to destroy things that can be used. On the other hand, there's respect for the king, and that is a high priority. So because of that high priority, it overrides certain other things. We're going to see it might even override Tzar Balei Chayim, which is going to be a more difficult one, right? Like even tortured animals. We're going to talk about this soon. Okay, so now we have a case, Shemet Rabban Gamliel is okay, and we're going to go back to Onkelos now. When he died, Saraf alav Onkelos hagel shiv'im manet suri. He burned 70 suri manot. Okay, now that is a crazy amount of money. Okay, he burnt a huge amount of money. So they say, Bahamart Maim Sorfim Alehem Mitatam B'Klei Tashmisham. But didn't they say they burn beds and things that serve the king, not money? So they say, well, Ema b'shiv'im manet suri. He burnt items of Rabban Gamliel in the worth of 70 manet suri. Umidi achrini lo. Now we have a problem. 1 minute. they don't burn other things, just the beds and the klei tashmishan of the king, the things that's right, the vessels that serve the king and the clothing. Wait a minute. V'hatanya okrin ala melachim ve'em bo mishum darchei amori. It says they cut some of the sinews of the animals near, like by their hooves. Okay, they would cut them. Okay, to basically make the animals not so useful anymore. Also, they do that for the king, and those aren't, can't call those things that serve the king, or maybe you can. So right now, okay, and we're going to get back to this Tzar Balei Chayim issue. Okay, so Tosfot already raises it right here, even though we're going to talk about it also later, which is at the end of the Tosfot, Dibor Matchil Krim Melchim, he asked this question about Tzar Balei Chayim. He says, what about that? And why doesn't the Gemara ask about that? So he says what I said before, which is Dishane Kvod HaMelech, the last line there, the respect for the king is important. Shehu kavod l'chol Yisrael. This goes back to what we said before about Onkelos saying about the Jewish people, that the respect of the king is the respect of all the people. And atek for rabim v'dachet tzar balei chayim. That overrides tzar balei chayim. Okay, which might be hard to swallow, right? But you have to see there were conflicting values here. Okay, so now their big question though is animals are not klei tashmishan, right? They're not vessels that serve the king. So Rav Papa says, what kind of animals are we talking about? Amar Rav Papa, sus shvachav alav. We're talking about the horse that he rode on, and that does serve the king. Okay, so they're now saying we're limiting what they would burn of the king that were animals or horses. Now they're going to say that can't possibly be, that it's limited to that. And then that resolved our klei tashmishan, because the horse is it's the horse the king rode on, and that's why they would do this. And so that no one else would ride. This, by the way, reminds us of the Achashverosh story, right? That, nobody rode on the king's horse, unless that was the whole thing. He wanted to give the most respect to Mordechai, to ride him on the king's horse. That was something no one ever did. Ubehema Torah lo, but wait, a horse is not a kosher animal. Now, there's a different source that talks about burning animals of the king that were kosher animals. And you're going to see in a minute, they're going to talk about whether it's a treifa, not a treifa. Treifa is only a concept that's relevant for kosher animals, right? A treifa is an animal that's going to die within 12 months, and that can't be slaughtered. Okay, you can slaughter it, but it won't be kosher. So that's where treif comes from. So be'emat Torah lo, wait a minute, but horses they ride on are not kosher animals, right? They don't ride on kosher animals, and look what it says here, V'hatanya, ikor sheyesh bat treifa asur, v'she'em bat treifa mutar. Uprooting these, cutting off the sinews of the animal, if it's going to become a treifa, it's forbidden to do. If it's not going to cause the animal to be a treifa, it's permitted. Okay, ezu ikor she'em bat treifa. I'll just continue one more sentence, and then we'll go back and explain. What is an ikor she'em bat treifa, just so we understand what we're talking about, turning out on a bed. Haminasher parsotah min arkuva ulamata. If you cut it below the knee, then it's actually not going to cause the animal to be a treifa, and that's permitted to do. Okay, so you're pointing out this isn't burning, this is cutting, right? It's a little different, but it basically means taking it out of commission. Okay, that's the idea here. When it comes to a vessel or clothing, it'll be burning it. When it comes to an animal, this is what they would do. They wouldn't burn the animal. Okay, but they would make it impossible for the animal to walk properly. Now, here, it's clearly talking about a kosher animal, and the kosher animals weren't really serving the king, or maybe they were. We'll see that in a minute. But before we get to the problem, the answer to the question, I want to look at Rashi. Rashi says, why is it forbidden to do it if it's right? It's forbidden to do if you're going to cause the animal to be a treifa, but not forbidden if the animal is not going to be a treifa. So in Dibor Matchil Asul, the last Rashi on the page, on Amud Aleph says, Asur lasoto, v'af al pi she'ein sofo lehenot mimenu, asur ligrom lebehema treifut biyadayim. Even though in the end you're not going to be able to benefit from it anyway, but you can't cause an animal to become a treifa bayadayim. And some people say that what Rashi is relating to here is Baal Tashchit. You're basically taking an animal and making it impossible to ever eat this animal, which is basically, you're not allowed to destroy things that can be useful. That's one explanation. The question is also right? So what's the issue here? So Rashi seems to think it's a Baal Tashchit issue. You're destroying an animal for being able to be eaten in the future. The Ritva says it's Tzar Balei Chayim, and that if you do it under the knee, it's actually not so painful. It's somewhat painful, but again, that's balanced by Kvod HaMelech. But if you're going to make the animal a treifa, that's very painful, and that's Tzar Balei Chayim. You're also causing it to die within 12 months. So that already, then if we're on the scale of what's more important, Kvod of the king versus Tzar Balei Chayim, the more that it's Tsar Balei Chayim, the Ritva says, then already we're going to worry about Tsar Balei Chayim and not worry about Kvod HaMelech. So that's a possible way to understand it. Also, there's an alternative. You can just do it in a way that's not. This whole sugya is complicated and difficult to swallow, that we're going to do things to torture animals that for the benefit of this Kvod HaMelech, which is hard for us to understand. Okay. Anyway, we're back to this question. Well, then it's not just things that serve the king. It said mitatan ukle mitatan, ukle tashmishan. And that doesn't seem to include kosher animals. What are they serving the king? Well, Tirgam Rav Papa be'egla moshecha bekaron. What do you mean? They use kosher animals to pull wagons, right? To pull the wagon of the king, the chariot of the king. So yeah, you could say that it's still klei tashmishan. And by the way, you're not destroying all the king's animals, just so you understand. It's just the ones that served in the king's chariot or the horse the king rode on, and then they had to take that animal out of commission, basically. Otherwise, it wouldn't be appropriate that someone else would be using the horse of the king. Okay, again, a bit of a difficult or quite difficult sugya in light of the whole Tsar Balei Chayim issue. Yom Tiglach, and by the way, it doesn't appear in the Gemara at all. It only appears in some of the Rishonim, but it does appear there, and there's some, attempt to address it. Yom Tiglach Hatzkano. Now we're back to the cases in the Mishnah. We're up to the next one. Now the Mishnah said Yom Tiglach Hatzkano ublorito. What is the blorit? The blorit is this particular haircut the king got, but it's not just a hair or anyone, right? We said this is possibly referring to anybody, and you'll see why it's referring to anybody. So what they would do is they would shave their beards and presumably haircut, but at the same time they would grow in the back of their heads this thing called a blorit, which we've used the word blorit in different ways. Sometimes it meant this rounded haircut. We talked about it with the payot. But it seems that they would grow this area in the back of their heads. They would grow it long. They would braid it. And then at some point, they would cut it and offer it up to the gods. So now they're going to talk about there's number one, the growing of it, which is for the sake of the gods. And when you cut your hair and don't cut it, that in of itself possibly is worshiping idols like that. Is that a day? So they want to understand what's this Yom Tiglach Hatzkano blorito. Now there seems to be this assumption that on the same day they would cut the hair, they wouldn't also cut the blorit. Okay, they would do one on one day and one on the other, okay, on a different day. So when they would shave the hair, they would actually leave the blorit to grow. And then there was a day where they would just cut the blorit, that braid. So Ibayalhu, the question is this: Heche Katani, how did we read this Mishnah? Is it Yom Tiglachatz Kano v'Hanacha Blorito? Is it the day they shave their beards and their hair, but leave the blorit to grow, and that day is a celebratory day? Oh, Dilma, or does this mean Yom Tiglachatz Kano v'Havara Blorito? Or does it mean two different days? The day they shave their beards and leave the blorit, and the day they cut off the blorit. So is it referring to one day, or is it referring to two different days? And then it means, right, either this, right, both days basically are going to be forbidden to do work, to do business dealings with the Gentiles and before. Well, that day, if you remember, that's on the list of only with that person and only on that day. So Tashma, let's learn from a Tanaitic source. Titania, it says in a braita, Titania Travayu. Both of them are in the braita. And then we're going to see the answer is all of the above. Okay, Yom Tiglachatz Kano v'Hanacha Blorito is listed as one in this braita, and then it says Yom Tiglachatz Kano v'Havara Blorito. So we have the day they shave and leave the blorit, and the day they shave, where they only shave, and the day where they take off the blorit. Okay, so you're going to have really both possibilities when they shave the blorit and when they grow the blorit, because both are really done for the sake of idol worship. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel. Now we're going to talk about days that are not listed in the Mishnah. They have another celebratory day. It's a holiday for them. It happens once every 70 years, which basically means once in everyone's lifetime, because most people didn't live more than 70 years. And in fact, if you look in the Koran, they have a good footnote where they talk about there's something called the secular games of the Romans that they have. And there's certain things about it that are similar to this, and perhaps that's what they're referring to, even though ours has a Jewish bent to it, okay, whereas that one is a more general thing. But what would they do? Now, what they're going to celebrate here is Esau over Yaakov. And they're going to say, Mivi'im Adam Shalem. They bring a person who's complete. You'll see why they're saying this. Umarkivino to aladam chiger. And then they put him on the shoulders of someone who's lame. Now, the lame is a reference to Yaakov, obviously, because after he fought with the angel, right, in the Esau story, he was limping. So they bring someone who limps, and then they put on his shoulders this person who's complete, who's a sign of Esau. Umalbishino to bigdei Adam Arishon. Okay, they give him the clothing of Adam Arishon. Okay, and they claim that this is the clothing of Adam Rishon, the Midrash, it was passed on to Nimrod, and then Esau took it from Nimrod, and then they put on these clothes that were passed down to Esau, and Esau basically wears them. The Roman who represents Esau is wearing these clothes of Adam Rishon. Umenichim lo birosho, and they put on his head karkiflo shel Rabbi Yishmael. Okay, Rabbi Yishmael was one of the Harugei Malchut. He's the one who we have a kina about his children, how they were beautiful and they were slaves, and they wanted to put them to, each owner said, oh, I have a beautiful one and I have a beautiful one. They mated them together at night and then they both die in the morning. Like they put them in a room together to give birth to children, and they each sat there, until they realized it was each other. Anyway, it's a kina for Tisha B'Av. You can pay attention this year when you get there. He was beautiful. And what the Romans did was they took off his face and like preserved it to show the Roman, what they did to destroy the Jews. So on his head, they put, a little bit weird to understand how they did this, but kind of the skull or the face of Rabbi Ishmael. Vitalu lebet savare mitkal arba zuzei de pisa, and then they put around his head something worth 4 zuzim. Umechapim et hashvakim bi'inach, and they decorate the shuk with onyx. Umachrizim lefanav, and they announce before him, Sach kiri plastel, achua de marana zayafna. The sach, the count that Yaakov did, and this goes back to what we saw about the 4,000 years that the Messiah is going to come and the Jews are going to be redeemed from the Romans and the Mashiach is going to come, are obviously wrong because we've gotten to there and it's no longer right. They don't have it. And the brother of Marana, of our leader, which is Esau, meaning the brother of Esau, which is Yaakov, is Zayafna, is a forger. Okay, he said wrong things because remember, Yaakov, it was said that he told the people when the end was going to be. Right, he revealed the secret to his sons, or he wanted to reveal the secret to his sons right before his death. Anyway, the point is the count that the Jews are doing is clearly wrong, and they're forgers, and it's all false because look, Mashiach hasn't come. Now there's a side point. Whoever saw this, is going to see this, and this is again what they're announcing. Whoever's going to see this is going to see this, and whoever does it will not, because if you're not here, you're not going to make it to the next one because it's in 70 years from now. My ahane l'rama abe rama ute l'zayafna b'zayfanute. By the way, Yaakov in general, right, is known to be a bit of a ramai from things he did in his life. So, what did this ramai, this trickster, succeed in his ramaut, and what did this zayafna, this forger, succeed in forging things? In other words, he's just a fake Yaakov. Okay, didn't succeed in doing anything. They finish with this. And woe is to he when the other rises up. Now here there's a bit of a different interpretation. Some people think that it means, but woe to Esau when Yaakov rises up. But that seems a little bit weird because this is really a holiday celebrating Esau, and it sounds more like they're saying, I would go more with the interpretation, that's not mine, but commentaries who interpret it that woe is to Yaakov when Esau rises up, because we know, right, that's the whole thing about the prophecy of Yaakov, right, that Yaakov got, that when Esau is up, Yaakov will be down. And woe is to Yaakov now when Esau is up. Okay, so that's another holiday. Amar Rav Ashi, Hichshilan Piem L'Rishayim. So before we get to dealing with, well, why is this not mentioned in the Mishnah? But the first thing we're going to say is, Rav Ashi says they worded things in a way that kind of trapped them up. Why? Now, pay attention to the words. The words when they talk about the brother of our ruler is a zaifan, is a forger, is a fake. Well, they say it. Notice that Esau is next to the word fake, right? It says Ahua, the brother of Marana, of our head, our leader, is a fake. Now, if they had said Zayafna Ahua de Marana, the faker is the brother of Marana, which puts the brother next to the Ziyuf, then Kidka Amri, then it would be like they said. But Hashida Amri de Marana Zayafna, in other words, since they say it's really Ahua de Marana Zayafna, but they put Marana next to Zayafna. So Marana Gufe Zayafnahu. You can learn from here that they're basically really saying that their own ruler, their own leader is a Zaifan, is a forger. Anyway, back to our topic. Vitana didam my time lahai. So why didn't our Tana mention this one? Well, de'ita b'chol shata v'shata kachashiv, de'leita b'chol shata v'shata lo kachashiv. Our Tana was only mentioning ones that come up every year. This doesn't come up every year. This comes up once every 70 years. And therefore, why would they even mention it, right? It's not worth mentioning. They mention the ones that come up every year. But of course, if you're standing before these days, you obviously can't do business with them. That is clearly idol worship. Now they're going to say, notice in the Mishnah, now, who were the rulers in the time of the Mishnah? The Romans. But now we're in Babylonia, in the Talmud Bavli, and they have different rulers. There's the Persians and there's the Babylonians. So they say, Hanu de Romai. These are the Roman ones. De Parsaimai. What are the Persian holidays? Mutrede, Vitoryaski, Muharniki, Umuharin. Okay, they mentioned these 4 holidays. Commentaries each try to explain what's the meaning of these various holidays, but we're going to leave that aside. And then they say, Hane de Parsayu de Romai. Okay, so we got the Persian ones, we got the Roman ones, but de Bavlaimai, what about the Babylonian ones? Muharniki, Ba'akniata, Ba'chanuni, Ba'asar, Ba'adar. Okay, so they mentioned these other 4 holidays of the Babylonians, and now we know, okay, so the people living in the time of the Gemara now know, okay, so we've got these holidays and those other holidays, right? And we have to, again, not do business with the Gentiles on all those holidays. Amar Rav Chanan bar Rav Chisda Amar Rav Amar le Amar Rav Chanan bar Rava Amar Rav. Okay, so Rav Chanan, either son of Rav Chisda or son of Rava, said in the name of Rav. Chamisha batei avodah zarah kvuim hem. There's 5 houses of idol worship that are kvuim. Kvuim means they're always there. Okay, we're going to see what the significance of kvuim is in another minute. So Eluhain, what are they? And now they start listing these places that were known as temple worship places for idols. Okay, pagan worship, worshiping spaces. Beit Bel beBavel, Beit Nevo beKorsi, right? Each one in Bavel it's Beit Bel, in Korsi it's Beit Nevo. Tarata sheba Mapag, it's another place. Srifa sheba Ashkelon, Nishra sheba Aravia. Okay, these are these 5 places where they worshipped idols. Ki ata Rav Dimi, when Rav Dimi came from Israel, Hosifa lehem Yerid sheba Bechi, Nidbacha sheba Akko. He added another 2 more. He said Yerid is one in Bechi and Nidbacha is one in Akko. Ikadamre, some people say the one in Akko is called Nitbara and not Nidbacha. Okay, they're not so different in letters, but a little bit. Rav Dimi Minahardia Amani Ibcha. Rav Dimi Minahardia said the opposite, which is Yerid Sheba Akko, Nidbacha Sheba in Bechi. They got the names wrong, okay, according to this version. It was the flip about which one was in Bechi and which one was in Akko. Okay. Amalei Rav Chanan bar Rav Chisda Rav Chisda. So now Rav Chanan, after passing down what he heard said in the name of Rav, he says to his father, "What is my kfuim? What does it mean that these are kfuim? What's the significance?" Amar le hachi amar avu adi mech. This is what your grandfather, your maternal grandfather, said. Kfuim hein laolam tadiro kulashata palchu lehu. These are set forever, meaning that every day they worship idols here. Every day they offer sacrifices to the idols. And because of that, you can never do any business relations with this, so to speak, this temple of the pagans. You can't ever do any kind of dealings with them because every day they're worshiping idols. Okay, so that's in addition to the fact that there's holidays, there's also places where you can never do business with them, right? But it doesn't really mean the city, it sounds like it means that temple. Amar Shmuel. Now here comes this line of Shmuel that we quoted earlier. Bagola eno asur el yom edam bilvad. In the diaspora, it's only the holiday itself. Now Shmuel seems to have made this huge heter. Now some people think it's because we talked about this before. They're not real idol worshippers. They're called pagans, but they don't really believe in paganism. Okay, they're not really idol worshippers, and therefore he was lenient because it was no longer like the Romans that were all pagans, but the rulers that they were with weren't really pagan worshippers. Or if they call themselves pagans, they really believe in the whole pagan thing. That's one possibility. It could be another possibility. Once you're in the diaspora, there's a lot more interactions with Gentiles, even though in Israel also they were interacting with Gentiles. But it was just near impossible to have these rules and not it really cut into their business. And Shmuel was trying to kind of relate to the needs of the people and became more lenient on these issues. It's another possibility. Either which way is definitely being more lenient. The question is why, and it's a good question. The Yom Edam Nami Miyasir. Now they say, wait a minute. Even the holidays aren't themselves, right? Because he basically said you could do the 3 days before, but not the holiday itself. But now they say, what do you mean? Even on the holidays, it's not forbidden. Because look, Vaha Rav Yehuda, Shari Leila Rabrona. Rav Yehuda permitted Rabrona. Remember, Rav Yehuda was a student of Shmuel. Lizabune chamra, to sell wine, ula Rav Gidol lizabune chitin, and Rav Gidol to sell wheat, bechagte d'tayeh, on the workers' holiday. I don't know if this is like Labor Day, May Day kind of thing, but there was a workers' holiday, and he permitted it. So they say, oh no, shane chagde d'tayeh de lo kvieh. This was different because it wasn't set. Now, what does it mean it wasn't set? It's a good question. Either it didn't have a set date during the year. Okay, there were different days they would just say, "Oh, today's the holiday of the merchants." I don't know. Or it's possible some other commentaries say what it means is it didn't happen every year, just like the other one that happened once every 70 years. This wasn't as infrequent, but it didn't happen on a yearly basis, and therefore they didn't forbid it. The weakness with that is that we seem to say before the Tana didn't mention it because of that, but it doesn't mean it wasn't forbidden. So, bit of a question how to understand this. Could be it just didn't have a set date. Because it didn't have a set date, that meant it's not going to be forbidden. Okay, so we resolved. It is forbidden on the holiday itself, even in the diaspora, but there's some holidays like the one of the merchants where it wasn't actually forbidden at all. New Mishnah. If you have a city with idol worshippers, now it's unclear exactly what this Mishnah is referring to. Okay, Rashi says there's a holiday for the people of this town. Okay, so you can obviously do business with them, but if the people living on the outskirts of the town, like outside the town, aren't engaged in this holiday, so you can do business with them. And likewise, if the people outside the city are doing idol worship, mutar, but the people inside the city are not keeping that holiday, then you can do business with the people inside. Okay, so what it means is even though you're in close proximity to a place that's worshiping idols, we don't assume that we have to, also not do business with those people as long as they're not involved in, and as a group, right? We have the inside and the outside, and they have different customs. So we don't have to stop doing work with one of them just because the other one is engaged in idol worship. Can you go into the city while they're worshiping their idols and doing their holiday? So it depends. If the path to that city leads only to that city, it's a dead end basically. You go into that city and there's nowhere else to go on the other side, right? There's one entrance to the city basically, and that road leads to the city. You can't go into the city because it looks like you're going in to worship idols. This seems to be like a Marat Ayin problem, the way it looks. But if you go into the city and you can get out on the other side and go to some other city and use it as a path to get to some other city, then obviously it's permitted because people will assume you're going to the other city. Okay, we're going to start with a question and we'll end here for today. What do we mean by chutzala? So Amar Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, B'Shum Rabbi Chanina, Kigon Atloza Shel Aza. Okay, like the Atloza of Aza. Okay, get to Aza in the Gemara here. What is Atloza? So Atloza is with an ayin, but we already had a flipping of ayin and aleph in the beginning of our Masechet, and some people say it's aleph, itliza, which is a butcher, okay, a slaughterhouse. Or possibly it means a bazaar, like that's the way they translate in the Koran, okay, like some big shuk, which is the Atloza of Aza was right outside the city, but it wasn't in the city. So, right, people will go right outside the city to do their shopping. So he's just bringing an example from their life that, they could understand. Ikeda Amre, some people say it wasn't, the Gemara asked, what is chutzala? And Rish Lakish answered this Aloz of Aza. But Ba'amine Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish mi Rabbi Chanina. Instead of Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish saying in the name of Rabbi Chanina, he asked Rabbi Chanina the following question. Aloz shel Aza mahu. Is it forbidden to do business in the Shuk of Aza, like when Aza has their holiday? Amrle lo halachta l'tzumi yamecha v're'iti Yisrael v'ovei kochavim sheshaftu shtei k'derot al kiracha v'lo chashu lehem chachamim. Were you not ever in Seoul, okay, which is in Lebanon, and seen a Jew and a Gentile cooking on the same stove with different pots, and the rabbis didn't stop them? Okay, what does this have anything to do with anything? Well, even though they were right next to each other, the Jew had his thing, the Gentile had his thing, and it was okay. So likewise, this Aloz of Aza, which is right next to Aza, but not doing the same thing as Aza, why would you think that's forbidden? Okay, what it means, we're going to get into tomorrow, but this is where we'll stop. And with this, we'll review our daf. So we had Onkelos, who we started with, who converted, and then we had that he basically, got all these other people to convert with him instead of them seizing him and taking him to the emperor. Then we went back to Antoninus and Rebbi, Shnei Goyim, Shnei Geyim, two great people. It was like this idyllic time, kind of as a foil to all this other, tensions we were talking about with the Romans and continue to talk about in the rest of the daf. Then we talked about the Yom HaLidah and Yom HaMitan, what this issue of the Sreifa is and the machlok of Rabbi Meir and the rabbis. From there, we got into the whole burning custom of burning stuff of the king and went into more details about that. From there, we got to this other holidays that aren't mentioned in the Mishnah. And why aren't they mentioned? And yet they're still forbidden, right? Like the one every 70 years, and then the Persian and the Babylonian ones, what those are. And from there, we ended with there's also temples of them that are forbidden to ever do business dealings with them because they're always sacrificing to their idols. And in the big heter of Shmuel, that in the Golah, it's only the holiday itself and not the days before. And then we started this Mishnah, which we'll deal with more tomorrow, about the city and outside the city, and where one is worshiping God as one isn't, the fact that we can differentiate between the two spaces, and then what do we mean exactly by chutzala, and that we started defining in the Gemara. That we finished for today. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shavua Tov.